Good afternoon. The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blue dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are these words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? I'll just read, there's many comments on this poem, which I found from the Poetry Foundation. But I'll read a couple of these comments. Yeats wrote The Second Coming while Europe and much of the rest of the world was trying to recover from World War I. This was surely an important factor for him in writing the poem. Yeats saw great social troubles all around him and remarks on a world spinning out of control. Line 2 hints at technology progressing beyond mankind's ability to control it. The problem was evident to Yeats 92 years ago, and the world had never seen destruction of the likes of World War I, and most people in the name of peace. I believe Spiritus Mundi leads Yeats to propose that perhaps the second coming of Christ is near at hand, Judgment Day, the end of the world. Spiritus Mundi brings an image of the Sphinx to Yeats's mind. Yeats sees the Sphinx rising up to bring forth the end of the world. The Sphinx slept in a world of nightmares for 2,000 years. The nightmares were caused by the turmoils of the human race, line 20. The indignant desert birds, aka humans who foresee the second coming, try to stop the Sphinx, the end of the world. But their task is impossible. In the end, Yeats reveals no hope for the continued existence of mankind. Then in the middle of another of these interpretations, I think there are more biblical representations than was brought out by the other comments. One, many people thought the second coming of Christ was surely at hand after the terrible loss of life and bloodshed after World War I, as does Yeats, as he writes in his poem. This is referred to in the book of Revelation, the last book included in the Bible. 2, Spiritus Mundi, spirit of this world, is commonly referred to as Satan in the Bible. even Jesus' own words while alive. 3. He does not seem to describe the Sphinx, and it rised out of a figurative desert, and maybe he was referring to the literal desert in the Middle East where Armageddon, the final war of wars, is to take place. 4. Also explained by biblical representations in the last stanza, that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Keeping in mind the overall message of the poem, the apocalypse, a rocking cradle, could refer to the birth of the Antichrist, literally and figuratively, and Bethlehem was the birthplace of Jesus Christ. The beast is slouching toward its aim, Bethlehem, to wreak havoc. The spirit of this world hates humans on this earth, even though the ultimate aim and greatest bloodshed will be his defeat. Maybe Keats saw that World War I, well, he wrote Keats, but he meant Yeats. Maybe Yeats saw that World War I didn't resolve conflict and saw something worse on the horizon, World War II. It would have been heart-wrenching to have witnessed such human waste. Okay, so that's sufficient to give you a taste of that. Now, before I go over to Edinger, I'll just read the poem once again so that you can enjoy it in its fullness. Hello, Art. Good afternoon. Welcome. I see my chat is back working again. I think it was garbage in, garbage out last night. I had the wrong setting, apparently. So, The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are these words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep are vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Okay, so that cheery apocalyptic poem reminded me of this book, Archetype of the Apocalypse, by Edward Edinger. And I wanted to read it to you anyway. I was thinking about reading it to you anyway, but I had an incredible synchronicity this morning, which I'll tell you about. So, Art, can we talk about sex and faith? Yes, maybe, but let me finish what I wanted to present first, and then I'll come back to that. So the synchronicity, I'm talking about apocalypse now, is that I've been reading The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, because I wanted to share that with my subscribers, since we've been talking about religious experience as the way to know in religion, as opposed to belief. And in the midst of reading this, I've been reading it in Audible as I drove, he mentions, James mentions that Ralph Waldo Emerson gave a incredible address about this topic in 1838, July 15th, 1838. This is called the Divinity School Address. And so if you want to look that up, you could look it up. I am planning to give it a try to read it. It's pretty long, but I want to read it on Thursday. Tomorrow, on Wednesday, I have our advanced reading group class, so I won't be able to do it tomorrow. And instead, I will do a brief reading tomorrow of Invictus, which I have ready to go here. And I'm doing all these poetry readings by special request of one of our subscribers, although this one, The Second Coming, was my own selection. But I wanted to tell you about the Synchronicity, which was, I was planning to read The Second Coming, and I thought of Dr. Edinger's book, Archetype of the Apocalypse, and I opened to the editor's preface of this book, and the editor says, speaking of Edinger, he was born in Iowa in 1922, a date he considered significant, as he said in an interview, for reasons that touch upon the topic of this volume. It was only a year after the appearance of William Butler Yeats's great apocalyptic poem, The Second Coming. It was the same year that T.S. Eliot published his scathing description of the modern soul in The Wasteland, and it was also in 1922 that Oswald Spengler finished his opus, The Decline of the West. And then on the same page, literally, I was just reading from here, and on the same page over here is this, speaking of Edinger. Edinger had long been convinced that Jung's psychological experience had given birth to a new worldview, an entirely new worldview, which has as its central principle and supreme value the human psyche with its unique phenomenon of consciousness. By this comment, the author was explaining why he had written an essay on the 19th century sage of Concord, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Quote, "If the new worldview is to take its place as a new cultural dominant, a long process of reorientation and assimilation is required. Just as emergent Christianity required the devoted efforts of generations to assimilate the previous Greek learning, so modern psychology will gradually assimilate into its own forms and modes of understanding the products of human culture that have preceded it. This task I take to be the responsibility of the analyst and psychologically informed laity of the present and future," unquote. And that came from Edinger's essay on Ralph Waldo Emerson. So, as I say, I will read Emerson's essay, which was a commencement address to the Harvard Divinity School, Dixon College, that he gave on July 15th, 1838. Now, and so I just thought it was incredibly interesting that I was going to read this poem anyway, and then I found not only the mention of that very poem, but also the mention of Emerson on the same page in the book that I was going to read. Now, Art, I certainly am interested in talking about sex and faith, but I do want to read in First, just the opening of this book, since we're talking about the apocalypse. And so as soon as I finish that, which should take about 10 minutes, we'll see what we can do. So this is chapter 1 of The Archetype of the Apocalypse by Edward F. Edinger. Archetype. In this book, we will examine what can be called the archetype of the apocalypse by way of a fairly close psychological study of the book of Revelation. I will rely primarily upon the New Jerusalem Bible version because it is a readily available, accurate translation, and it provides in footnotes all references to the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. As the reader will discover, the New Testament book of Revelation is loaded with direct quotations from the Old Testament. We will examine this text intensively rather than review an extensive body of material, and I suggest that the reader consult the scriptures to be discussed prior to reading each chapter, looking up references found in the biblical footnotes. In doing so, each person can make an important discovery by becoming involved in a kind of spontaneous amplification process, discovering in consequence what a rich mosaic the book of Revelation really is. One cannot grasp Revelation by a superficial reading. In many ways, it strikes the modern mind as bizarre and almost unintelligible. But if one applies oneself carefully to it, especially considering the quotations that are embedded in the text, the book begins to reveal itself. I always pay attention to the titles of other books and naturally pay attention to my own. My title here is Archetype of the Apocalypse. Let us try to identify each term and ask ourselves, first of all, what is an archetype? We may think we know if we have studied Jungian psychology, yet it does not hurt to be reminded. First of all, an archetype is a pattern, a primordial psychic ordering of images that has a collective or generalized quality. It can be understood, therefore, to derive from the collective transpersonal objective psyche, rather than from the personal psyche. That is one aspect of an archetype. The other aspect, to which we do not pay quite as much attention, but which does deserve emphasis, is that the archetype is a dynamic agency. It is a living organism, a psychic organism that inhabits the collective psyche. And the fact that an archetype is both a pattern and an agency means that any encounter with an archetype will have these two aspects. As a pattern, we can encounter an archetypal reality and speak about it as an object of our knowledge and understanding. But as a dynamic living agency, it appears to us as a subject, as an entity like ourselves with intentionality and some semblance of consciousness. Jung refers to this double aspect of archetypes at the beginning of his seminal work, Answer to Job, where he says, quote, "They are spontaneous phenomena which are not subject to our will, and we are therefore justified in ascribing to them a certain autonomy. They are to be regarded not only as objects, but as subjects with laws of their own. If that is considered, we are compelled to treat them as subjects. In other words, we have to admit that they possess spontaneity and purposiveness, or a kind of consciousness and free will," unquote. The reader should keep in mind that as we proceed to analyze the apocalypse archetype in particular, because it is like all archetypes when they are evoked, constellated, or activated. This archetype of the apocalypse takes on autonomy and tends to direct whatever is of a psychic nature in its vicinity to line up with its own lines of force. Apocalypse. The other term in the title is apocalypse. Apocalypsis is just the Greek word that was used for the book of Revelation, which is also more simply called the apocalypse. In general, the term means revelation, but specifically, it refers to the uncovering of what has been hidden. The root is the verb kalypto, which means to cover or to hide. The prefix is the presupposition, apo, which means away or from. So apocalypse means, quote, to take the covering away, unquote, from what had been secret or covered, revealing thereby what had previously been invisible. Yet according to general usage, the term apocalypse has taken on the larger meaning of the coming of deity to assert sovereignty, or the coming of a Messiah to judge, to reward, or punish humanity. We have a whole body of literature in antiquity that can be called apocalyptic, and which grew up around the idea of an apocalypse. There are a number of Jewish and Christian apocalypses in the extra-canonical literature, but certainly the canonical Apocalypse of John that we are about to study here is the most famous of that genre. The main characteristic of apocalyptic literature is that it describes dreams, visions, or journeys to heaven, whereby the seer is shown otherworldly secrets and programs of world history that culminate in the end of an age. Typically, an apocalypse contains images of the Last Judgment, with the coming of a Messiah or a divine king who will impose his punishments but then reconstitute things or bring about a new order. More particularly, this literature exhibits 4 chief features. 1, revelation. 2, judgment. 3, destruction or punishment as the consequence of judgment. And then 4, renewal in a new world. What I call the apocalypse archetype underlies all the ancient literature. It is composed of a network of interrelated images, as are all archetypes, making up a complex symbol system. To hint at some of the images that cluster around the archetype, I offer the following chart of interconnections. Its contents are somewhat arbitrary, since it is in the nature of an archetypal network that it can extend farther and farther, eventually to encompass the whole collective unconscious. And unless one imposes some sort of limit on the procedure, one will drown the process. Perhaps this chart can serve nonetheless as a roadmap for our subject matter, or as a general overview of the purpose of orientation. Most of the images referred to here I will discuss in some detail in the following chapters. See figure 1.1. Now, I'm sorry I didn't scan this figure in advance of this reading, but let me just show it to you on the screen, and then in the playback you can stop the video and take a look at what the image says. This is the apocalypse archetype. Okay. Sorry, that was not perfect, but I have 3 more pages. Let me repeat. What we are about to discuss is a primordial psychic pattern of the collective unconscious that is at the same time a dynamic agency with intentionality. When it constellates, it generates itself and manifests itself in the individual psyche and the collective psyche of the group it happens to touch. Put differently, archetypes live themselves out in whatever psychic stuff they can appropriate. They are like devouring mouths, finding little egos they can consume and then living out those egos. The apocalypse archetype certainly constellated very powerfully at the beginning of the Christian eon, and that is why so much apocalyptic literature was generated at that time. Now again, on the threshold of a new eon, the same archetype is constellating very powerfully. I will be giving examples of the different ways this is happening today in both the individual and the collective. Rather than keep the reader in suspense, I will answer the basic question of our study at the outset, and then allow the remainder of this work to be an enlargement upon it. The question that really concerns me here is this: what does the apocalypse mean psychologically? My essential answer is the apocalypse means the momentous event of the coming of the self into conscious realization. My essential answer is of course it manifests itself and is experienced in quite different ways if occurring in the individual psyche or in the collective life of a group. But in either case, it is a momentous event, literally world-shattering. This is what the content of the archetype presents: the shattering of the world as it has been, followed by its reconstitution. In terms of collective phenomena, we have evidence all around us in our daily analytical practice and in contemporary world history that this earth-shaking archetypal event is taking place right here and now. It has already started. It is manifesting itself in international relations, in the breakdown of the social structures of Western civilization, in political, ethnic, and religious groupings, as well as within the psyches of individuals. One can perceive the apocalypse archetype active in all these arenas, once one is familiar with its contents and has eyes to see. One can see further evidence in books, movies, and television programs. The possible encounter with extraterrestrial intelligence is an image that is more and more gripping the modern mind. And in many cases in science fiction, these encounters are followed by apocalyptic consequences, an aspect of the archetype. One can see the archetype of the apocalypse in the proliferation of apocalyptic cults or sects. And when we consider the phenomenon of religious groups that are quite explicitly identified with this archetype, and not just marginally so, I see a whole spectrum. At one extreme, there is the apocalyptic cults of a semi-suicidal nature that are often no more than large family groupings centered around a charismatic character who is quasi-criminal or quasi-psychotic, or both. Such figures as Charles Manson, Jim Jones, or David Koresh. These cults are extreme versions of group possession, concrete group possession by the apocalypse archetype. A little less extreme, but still far out along the spectrum, are the bomb shelter, stockpiling, survivalist cults who are holing up in remote regions, heavily armed and waiting for Armageddon. Farther along the spectrum are the apocalyptic sects of a larger scale. Let me note that the only difference between a cult, a sect, and a denomination is numerical. A small group is considered to be a cult. A religious group of 500,000 or to 1 million members is a sect. And if there are 10 million members, that is a denomination. Basically, there is no other difference. Of course, the larger the grouping, the more religious issues get ironed out, or shall we say, the fire gets damped down. Now, there are several of these larger apocalyptic sects, but probably the most well-known are Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists. They each have between 750,000 and 1 million members in the United States alone, with worldwide connections as well, and they are becoming almost conventional just by virtue of their statistics. Still farther along the spectrum of apocalyptic groups are the relatively more moderate and even conventional fundamentalist churches, who are convinced that the time of the end is upon us. 50 years ago, when I first began to observe this phenomenon, mainstream Christian fundamentalism did not have such a prominent apocalyptic tone, but today there are millions of Americans who are expecting to be raptured up to heaven at any moment. There are millions of Americans who have these convictions. Finally, at the end of the spectrum of possession are the apocalypse archetype. By the apocalypse archetype are the apparently secular rationalist environmentalists. I do not mean merely people who are concerned about the environment. I mean those whose behavior and way of life indicate that they are functioning out of a religious dimension of their libido. It is always the passionate intensity that reveals possession by an archetype. So one does not even have to be consciously religious to be possessed by the sacred power of archetypal reality. In addition to these collective manifestations of the apocalypse archetype, we have individual manifestations, which therapists are in a position to see all the time. When the imagery of the apocalypse archetype comes up in analysis, it can be immediately recognized as part of the phenomenology of the individuation process, representing in an individual the emergence of the self into conscious realization. And those 4 aspects that I mentioned earlier with regard to apocalyptic literature apply also to an individual manifestation: revelation, judgment, destruction or punishment, and a new world. Here, 1, revelation has the psychological correlate of shattering new insight accompanied by the flow of transpersonal images into consciousness. 2, judgment is experienced in the form of an abrupt, profound awareness of the shadow, which at times can be so overpowering that it can threaten complete demoralization. When someone is confronted with his dark and dubious nature, that he is known only abstractly and intellectually, but then suddenly it comes into focus as living concrete reality, that is a big shock. 3, the theme of destruction or punishment is manifested as the individual's anxiety in the midst of this transformation ordeal. And 4, finally, the coming of a new world corresponds to the emergence of mandala and quaternity images within the psyche, as there begins to appear the possibility of a conscious relation to the self and its wholeness. Okay, so I've been reading from Archetype of the Apocalypse by Edward F. Edinger, and I urge you to take a look at this book. Let's see. Yami says, keep Yeats' coming out of it for now. Collective psyche is also called the hive mind by programmers in AI terms today. I think the space in which the Jehovah's Witness groups are inflated by the archetype. Okay. So Art, go ahead. Are you still there? If you're still there, what would you like to talk about on sex and faith? This will be a separate topic in this conversation. I think we've covered the archetype of the apocalypse per se, but I can talk about sex and faith if art is still there for a few minutes. Okay. I think I have lost him. I apologize to Art for not getting to his point, but I had a specific topic that I wanted to get through today. And the general time for interaction, for general discussion, is normally Monday evening at 8 p.m. Unfortunately, last night when I ran the session, I didn't have the right setting on and I could not see the chat. And so CC, what does that mean? What do you mean by CC? Means you're there. I see you're there now. So what is your point that you want to talk about? Sex and faith. While I wait for your response, I can say that I think that many people, can a person be a believer, a B? Okay, well, I'll finish my thought here. I think that many people consider sex, when properly executed, a spiritual experience, and I certainly do, and when I experience it, I always want to emphasize that spiritual experience. So can a person be a believer, asexual? I'm sorry, I'm still not understanding your question, Art. So could you spell it out a little bit more? You know, a lot of young people think that sex is something that you do and get over with in a minute and a half or something like that. And I don't consider that appropriate either for procreation or for spiritual experience. But anyway, so Art, I'm still not understanding your question, I'm sorry to say. Opiami says he's asking about the birds and bees and butterflies. Okay, just as a side, while I'm waiting to see if Art will give me something that I can respond to, Dr. Edinger was the son of a Jehovah's Witness, and he did not have a favorable experience to his religious upbringing, not at all. And when he finally had an interaction with Esther Harding, who was one of the direct disciples of C.G. Jung, his psyche was opened up, and the two of them then founded the C.G. Jung Institute and the C.G. Jung Foundation in New York City. So Opiami says art, sex, and faith is one. I think that that is certainly a valid interpretation of it. Obviously, these things fall along a spectrum of individual experience, and so we each experience these things differently. I'm sorry, I only have a minute or two left before I have to leave to meet my wife, but if there's anything further, otherwise, Art, I would urge you to send me an email. I'll give you my email address, and you can write to me. So Art says, why is it that people hate gays and think that sex is bad? Okay, two questions. Let's address the first one second. I'll address the second question first. Why do they think sex is bad? Okay, I suspect that goes back to early civilization times, when, if you look at prides of monkeys, for example, or not prides, but if you look at monkeys or apes, they're pretty much free form in their sexuality. And we had to, as a species, learn to control those urges so that we could live together, because otherwise we end up being at war constantly. And so, for example, marriage, I'm sure, came up as a way to calm down people's behavior toward one another. It's why thou shalt not commit adultery is one of the 10 Commandments, because even at the time of Moses, I'm sure committing adultery, first of all, there was a concept of adultery at that time, obviously, which is a time about 1,200 years before Christ, and the need for that commandment obviously suggests that civilization needed it. So that's why people think sex is bad, because when sex drives you to make love with another man's wife or husband, for example, it can cause big disruptions in civilization, as we know. And as far as why is it that people hate gays, I think that relates to the church trying to regulate our behavior through rules. And, it's not always appropriate. For example, we currently have this NoFap thing going around where people are trying to prevent masturbation. And it's certainly up to each one of us to decide what we need to do with our own physiology. And I would say that's just the church guilt tripping as a method of trying to control you. And the churches have done a lot of that over the centuries. And so they get away with it because most people aren't gay, so they use that as a way of controlling gay people. But it's not fair and it's not appropriate. And we now know that people can fall anywhere on a whole spectrum of sexuality, and people can live perfectly happy lives as a gay life. And so, I think that we need to push back on that idea that people shouldn't be gay. I just wanted to read, because we're talking about it. This is the first paragraph of Psychic Energy by Esther Harding, who was Dr. Edinger's mentor. And so let me just read the first paragraph, or maybe a little bit more, and then I'm going to have to push on. But this is the first paragraph of Esther Harding's book, Psychic Energy. Beneath the decent facade of consciousness, with its disciplined moral order and its good intentions, lurk the crude instinctive forces of life, like monsters of the deep, devouring, begetting, warring endlessly. They are for the most part unseen, yet on their urge and energy life itself depends. Without them, living beings would be as inert as stones. But were they left to function unchecked, life would lose its meaning, being reduced once more to mere birth and death, as in the teeming world of the primordial swamps. In creating civilization, man sought, however unconsciously, to curb these natural forces and to channel some part at least of their energy into forms that would serve a different purpose. For with the coming of consciousness, cultural and psychological values began to compete with the purely biological aims of unconscious functioning. So throughout history, two factors have been at work in the struggle to bring about the control and discipline of these non-personal instinctive forces of the psyche. Social controls and the demands of material necessity have exerted a powerful discipline from without, while an influence of perhaps even greater potency has been applied from within the individual himself in the form of symbols and experiences of a numinous character, psychological experiences that have had a powerful influence on certain individuals in every community. So I just also point out one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Jung, which appears in Volume 7 of the Collected Works, paragraph 32. And the quote is, "Too much of the animal distorts civilization. Too much civilization makes sick animals." And so it's up to mature adults to decide how much is too much civilization and how much we should live our instinctive lives. And so anyway, Opiami says, art, number one, sex is good. 2, any moron that tells you otherwise is socially conditioned to hate. They're idiots, or idiots. And I see that there is one message held for review, but I do not have time to review it right now. I will, let's just see quickly. Oh, I'm sorry, that must be Opiami's response. So I'll approve that. And so I'm sorry, I do have to go at this point. Tomorrow I will be running the advanced reading group at 1:30 p.m. for those of you that are in the Mysterium Conjunctionis seminar. And in the morning, I will do a quick reading of Invictus. And then hopefully on Thursday, if time permits, I will read the Divinity School Address by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which was given in 1838 to Harvard Divinity School. And I haven't decided whether I'll schedule a time or just do it, but I'll try to make it as convenient as possible. So I'm sorry, but I have to move on for today, and I will see you all again soon.